Hello and welcome back to Answering Bart Ehrman. Now, why should you subscribe to this channel and watch all of our videos? Well, you should do it because we're the only channel that is actually reading its way through one of his whole books, reading it page by page, and answering it argument by argument. And so that's why you should subscribe to this channel, because what we're doing is unique, and we're going to give you a resource to answer each of his arguments in a short video. And so today we're going to continue doing that. Matthew and I are going to continue doing that. And Matthew, how are you today?
Doing all right, thanks, Sam. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good.
Yeah,
so look, we're up to page 51. And how about you introduce that for us and read out what we need to hear?
Yeah, so we're in a section where we've got a bunch of alleged differences between the accounts of the Passion narratives in the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' death, basically. And so this one is number 4 on page 51. And the question is, when was the curtain in the temple ripped? Let me read it and we'll have a chat about it. So he says, the curtain in the temple separated the holiest place, called the Holy of Holies, from the rest of the temple precincts. It was in the Holy of Holies that God was thought to dwell here on earth. He obviously is reigning in heaven as well. No one could enter that room behind the curtain except once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, when the high priest could go in to offer a sacrifice, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. According to Mark's Gospel, after Jesus breathes his last, the curtain of the temple is torn in half. This has long been recognized as a symbolic statement, for there is no historical evidence to suggest that the curtain was ever destroyed before the temple itself was burned to the ground 40 years later in the war with the Romans. For Mark, Jesus' death means the end of the need for temple sacrifices. In his son's death, God is now available to all people. He is no longer separated from them by a thick curtain. Jesus' death makes people one with God. It is an atonement or an at-one-ment for sin. Luke's Gospel also indicates that the curtain of the temple was ripped in half. Oddly enough, it does not rip after Jesus dies, but is explicitly said to rip while Jesus is still alive and hanging on the cross. And that's his basic claim for that section.
Okay. So there's 2 main claims that he's making there. The first is that there's no historical evidence that the temple got ripped.
The temple curtain, yep.
That the temple curtain got ripped, as we read in Mark. And so Mark is a symbolic statement that he's making.
Yep.
Because there's no historical evidence that it got ripped. And then he's saying that Mark and Luke say that it got ripped at different times. Mark says that it got ripped after Jesus dies. Luke says it got ripped before Jesus dies. So I think we'll look at the accounts in Mark and Luke first, and then we'll come back to that historical and symbolic question second. So let's get up the verses for everyone so we can actually read it. There we are. I'll read all of them from Matthew as well. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. And then in Mark, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. So saying exactly the same thing there. He breathes his last, the temple curtain is torn. And then in Luke we read, it was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light faded, and the curtain of the temple was torn in 2. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. So there they are. Mm-hmm. So any comments there?
He seems to be mistaking 2 sentences being the other way around to 2 events happening at different times, I would suggest. I mean, they're all both describing the same basic event, aren't they? Jesus is dying on the cross and some stuff happens. Among them, the temple curtain rips. well, we've got Jesus dying on the cross and the temple curtain rips. Neither of them is making any big claim about the specific moment when the curtain temple rips in relation to Jesus' death, like, immediately before he dies or immediately after. It's just these things happen together. On my reading, that seems to be what both of them are saying. So it's hard to see. Like, he seems to be making a lot of very little, namely that two sentences were the other way around.
Yeah. And look, the way I see this is that there's overwhelming agreement, as we often say with these issues that Bart brings up. There's overwhelming agreement. And it's not that one is saying the temple curtain ripped 3 hours before the other one, right? Yeah. They're actually both describing the very moment of Jesus' death. So, but both of them are talking about the very moment. Now, the order in which they present what happens at that very moment is in a different order. Okay, but the actual time they're talking about is the very moment of his death. And they're saying at the very moment of his death, he breathed out his last, he crawled out, the temple curtain was torn in two. You can have that in different orders because it's talking about the very moment. So there's basically nothing there. You're being really desperate. Look, let's move on to the historical evidence one. So he said here that, let me just read this again. It has long been recognized as a symbolic statement. This is in Mark. For there is no historical evidence to suggest that the curtain was ever destroyed before the temple itself was burned to the ground, some 40 years later in the war with the Romans. So he's saying that when Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about the temple curtain being ripped, that it's symbolic because we don't have external historical evidence to back it up.
Yeah, well, he doesn't even qualify it the way you just have. If he said the statement you just did, external historical, like he says there's no historical evidence. And you just go, well, most historical evidence we have for this period and ancient period in general is testimony, written testimony, right? And we've got written testimony in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We just saw it. So there is historical evidence. There's actually these testimonies of what happened at the time of Jesus' death. And you can argue that that's false or whatever, but it's there and it's ancient and there is historical evidence to engage with.
Sure. Look, I think that's a really good point. That he's just dismissing the Bible as history to start, like, as a straight away.
Okay. That's a sleight of hand. We can't let slip. These are historical claims about Jesus. It's really it's also could take issue with claiming, like, the contrast between it's a symbolic thing that happened, therefore it can't be a historical thing. I mean, so many historical things, even outside the Bible, that are symbolic actions, and deliberately so, were also real events that happened. I mean, the whole sacrificial system that this bit refers to from the book of Leviticus is it's a thing that historically happened, but all of the actions that made it up was symbolic for the washing away of sin and that kind of thing. And so that the temple being torn symbolized reconciliation of God with humanity in Christ. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means it was a real thing that happened that symbolized something really important.
Look, just when you're saying that, it made me think of Jesus riding the donkey into Jerusalem. So that is a highly symbolic act that he's doing to anyone who knows the book of Zechariah. So that's a symbolic statement. Now, did it actually happen? Yes. Is it symbolic? Yes. You can have two. So it's not even a coherent statement to say, it's symbolic, therefore it's not historical. But look, I want to bring up an interesting reference that I've seen people referring to recently. And that is that, contrary to what Bart Ehrman might say, there is some historical evidence that God's approval of the temple had ceased. Right? And so remember that Jesus is crucified and dies, and resurrected around, 30, 33, somewhere around there. So around in the very early 30s. And what we find in the Talmud is that they say that from this time, from around the time of Jesus' death up until the destruction of the temple, that the normal events that showed God's approval had stopped.
So this is the source you're citing here is significant too, isn't it, Sam? Because this isn't a Christian source. This is a Jewish source, a non-Christian Jewish source. So we're not talking about people within the Jesus movement trying to reaffirm what they already believe. We're talking about other people who don't believe what the claims of Christianity are.
Exactly.
Anyway, please go on.
Yeah. So there were a whole lot of events that would happen to show God's approval of the temple. And what it says is that for the 40 years before the destruction, these things stopped. And 40 years beforehand is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Yeah. So I'll just read it out. Our rabbis taught during the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the lot, so that this is when they would cast lots for this for the scapegoat, and one goat would be sacrificed, one goat would be sent out in the wilderness. So the lot for the Lord did not come up in the right hand. So it wasn't coming up in the right place, nor did the crimson-colored strap become white. So they would have this crimson-colored wool, and it would fade to become white. And that was what they understood to be God's approval of the cleansing of the blood, making things clean. Nor did the westernmost light shine, and the doors of the Hekel, that is the temple, would open by themselves. So the doors would just crack open and open up, and open themselves up there. So I just find this really interesting that there actually is this historical document saying that from the time of Jesus onwards, the confirmations, the normal confirmations that God had been giving in the temple as the Jews understood them, had stopped. Stopped. Yeah. And that actually aligns perfectly with the temple curtain being ripped in two.
Yeah. Yeah, it's extraordinary, actually. This it sounds like the sort of thing that if you were cynical, you say Christian apologists made this up or something, but it's actually not the Christian saying this. It's quite amazing.
Yeah. So anyway, there we go. Look, I think that'll do us for today. So next week we will come back and join us, and we're going to be looking at what did the centurion say when Jesus died. So make sure to click that subscribe button and go back through our old videos and get armed up and educated on how to respond to Bart Ehrman. And we shall see you next week.